Thank you, everyone. Thank you for coming. This is the first edition in the summer of the summer term of the Monday Majlis, and Ayşe is our guest, and I'm very, very grateful she accepted this invitation as early as in December when we met. I met Ayşe at a conference, and I was very, very impressed by her talk. And her research focuses on the Ottomans, the Qizilbash, and the Safavids, and Sunnis and Shias. But I think, and I'm pretty sure this talk today will also show that her research gives us insight into general patterns about state building and the flexibility of it, and especially on the margins in conflict zones. So how fluid is real life situation, how fluid they are, and in consequence also ideologies and allegiances. So though you have a very, very, very pinpointed focus, I think it has really large implications. So yes, Ayşe, could you please present yourself, and then we will go for your research.
Thank you, Ishwan. It's a pleasure to be here today. Can you all hear me well? Okay.
Yes,
perfect.
we can.
So it is a pleasure to be here. As Ishwan mentioned, we met at the latest Mesa in Denver, and we very quickly struck a chord, and I'm glad to be here today as a part of this series of talks. And as Ishwan mentioned, my research focuses on Ottoman and Safavid empires between the 15th and the 17th centuries, particularly from the perspective of this understudied but extremely important community of the Qizilbash. Some of you may have heard who they are, and some of you may have not. And my talk today is going to be assuming that you haven't heard them. So I'm not assuming that you already know who they are. But I was told that the first segment of the talk is more or less an intellectual biography or a life story in terms of why I am doing what I am doing and how I got to this point. And I'm going to start with that before I move on to my more academic talk, right? Am I correct, Ishwan? So as some of you may have read from the short bio that was circulated, I am an assistant professor in the departments of history and Middle Eastern and Islamic studies at NYU at New York University. And I started my position here in 2018, September. And I finished my PhD at Ohio State University under the supervisory of Professor Jane Hathaway and Carter Finley, who are two of the prevalent and renowned professors of Ottoman studies. Jane Hathaway does early modern Ottoman history, and Carter Finley does late Ottoman history. And I finished my PhD in 2016 and started as an assistant professor at State University of New York at Binghamton at the same year. And I was there for 2 years. And at the end of my second year, I moved to NYU. And since then, I'm here. So how I got to where I am here now, it's actually not a conventional story. It's actually a very unconventional story. And I don't know how much of it you want to know, but I'm going to try to summarize it as engagingly as possible. Let me start with that. I was 16 when I finished high school. As the oldest daughter of a working class family, and my parents were not educated. My mom finished middle school, or maybe she didn't even finish middle school, and my dad finished high school. So they really did not know how to navigate the system in terms of higher education. But I was a very good student, and they knew that the next step would be going to university. And in like many places in Turkey, you will take a central exam where millions of students will take just once a year. And I took that exam and I got a very high score. But because of the limitations and the ignorance about the system, I found myself at a university in Ankara studying in the School of Communications. So I really was like a fish out of the water, trying to understand who is who, what is what does it mean to be at the university, and what do you do when you are at the university, and how do you study one would become after you graduate. And years really passed by very quickly at the end of the four years, and I graduated. And I started to work at a computer company after a short stint at the newspaper. And I realized that where I was in my life at the age of 22 was really not what I wanted to be. And the one thing that I very quickly realized that the major problem or the major issue that I had at the time was that I did not speak a word in English. And I thought, well, this has to be rectified, and I need to find a way to learn English. Maybe then I can actually use my degree in a more meaningful way, and I can become something better and something more useful, and also doing more exciting things. And I looked around and I started to ask people how you would learn English at late as this age and without knowing other than yes or no. And some people suggested some language schools, and they were very expensive. And I actually didn't know anybody who would speak fluently after attending a school here and there. And what I thought was that, well, the best way to learn English with minimal cost is to go to a language school run by a university whose education of language of education is English. And as some of you know, in Turkey, there are a small number of universities whose education is in English, like the Bosphorus University in Istanbul, and Bilkent in Ankara, and Koç and Sabancı universities, and Middle East Technical University in Ankara. And I took the exam again, and I got a very high score. And I got a full scholarship at one of the newly rising private universities owned by one of the richest families in Turkey, namely Koç. And I thought I can just attend the language school. I was in full scholarship, everything will be free. I will learn English in 1 year, and then I will just go back to wherever I was or start looking for jobs in Istanbul. Little I knew that when I was studying English in my first year, I really, for the first time, got a sense of what academia is. And how would one become an academic? How would one actually start to work as a professor? And I realized that for that, you need to do a PhD, and United States is the place, or England is the place to do if you want to be hired by this small number of elite universities in Turkey. And I said, well, maybe I should actually stay at Koç and do my study in history, because I was in the Department of History after the language school. So I passed the language test, which we had to take a TOEFL at the end of the first year to continue in full scholarship. I was able to do that. And I studied another 4 years in the Department of History at Koç University. And at that time, I was way more conscious and aware of this maze, as we call academia, in terms of what will one do. And in a very close relationship, almost like a hands-on relationship between me and a small number of professors whom I met in the history department, all of whom did their PhDs at American institutions or English institutions. I really took advantage of that and finished at the end of 4th year, applied for graduate school and got into a number of them, picked Ohio State. And this is how my unconventional or non-traditional way into academia started. In terms of why I am studying the Qizilbash, that is more of a personal story. As you may, particularly those of you who are familiar with Islamic history, Ayşe is the Turkified version of the name Aisha, right? The Arabic name Aisha, and it is not a name that you will actually see among Shia communities. It is usually a name revered by the Sunni. That gives a hint in terms of the family, in terms of the background, religious background that I am a part of. So I grew up in a traditional, not a very sectarian, but traditional conservative Sunni family. But in terms of where we lived in Ankara was a neighborhood where the most of the population was Shia, or we call Alevi today in modern Turkey. So the language about the Alevis or the Shia or the communal relationship was always there. The term Qizilbash, however, was a term that nobody was supposed to mention or use. Actually, growing up up until the years late 1990s or early 2000, that was almost like a K word that you are not supposed to mention, because it had over the time, the last 300 years, it really acquired a very derogatory meaning, connotation, and it became a term that you were not supposed to use. But in the early 2000s, that started to change, that we started to hear the word Qizilbash, the term that I will hear from my very Sunni-minded grandpa, that you started to hear people calling themselves Qizilbash in a more revivalist way, in a more being proud of who they are and claiming where they are coming from and claiming their past and being not ashamed of that, but being proud of that, particularly in urban centers among the educated. And in Ankara, I was a part of that. And I started to realize that there is this shift happening in terms of how to use the word, or who can use the word Qizilbash and what it means. And it really spiked my interest in terms of where this is coming from. What does it mean to be a Qizilbash? Why we weren't supposed to use that, and now all of a sudden the Qizilbash themselves, or the Alevi community in Turkey themselves, are using this more freely. And being in a history department, I wanted to know the past of that in terms of the formation of the community itself and the sociopolitics of it. Because as an early age, I grew up in a religiously conservative family, but I was always interested in the question, why? Why are we doing certain things the way that we are? Like, I was really inquisitive in many ways, and I really carried that perspective into my study of Ottoman history. And one of my professors at Koç, who was teaching a class on 17th century Ottoman Empire, particularly on Evliya Çelebi, who is one of the most well-known travelers, Ottoman travelers of the 17th century, who wrote a 10-volume Seyahatname, or book of travel. And the course was on that, and seeing the Qizilbash in it, and seeing Evliya Çelebi's discussion of religious sectarian tensions, and the stereotypes that were used, and in labelings that he used, really made it even more interesting for me. That I thought, well, this is an interesting topic that we are only learning along the lines of stereotypes, rather than, at least in my, at the time, I really didn't know much about it. And whatever I put my hands on were not really satisfactory in terms of answering the questions of why, or answering the questions of, can we really explain everything by sect? Can we really explain everything by sectarian understanding of the past? What type of a role politics play in this? What type of a role finances, let's say taxation, play in it? Started to become the core of my research interests, because I always thought money matters, regardless of the time period, regardless of the religion or the region. Money is really, I mean, you may find this very materialist approach, but it is my approach, and I always try to ask the questions about money. And in this case, it became questions about taxation, because we learn Ottoman history, particularly in the early modern context. It is an empire, a huge imperial machine, whose gas was taxation, the revenue was taxation. So I thought, like, well, if this is the major revenue, if this is the only way that the empire could function, where did this religious minorities, from today's perspective, of course, there were no religious minorities in the 16th, 17th centuries, there were religious communities or sectarian communities, where did they fit into this whole taxation system? And what did the state do if the sole purpose was to tax the re'aya, was to tax the subjects to a level where it will guarantee its sustainability and its future? So these questions, on the one hand, my interest in sectarianism, my interest in sectarian communities from my childhood and from my personal background. On the other hand, my more educated, more intellectual interest in money and taxation and the formation of social, economic, and in religious communities kind of merged along the idea of, well, I want to study the Qizilbash, but not from a religious perspective per se, not from a theological perspective per se, but I want to study the Qizilbash as an important point, important actor within the broader socioeconomic, cultural, religious history of the Middle East, but also the particularly in Western Asia part of the Middle East. I started as an Ottomanist, but I soon realized that these borders and boundaries that we are taking very quickly at face value are not really there when you are looking at the sources, when you are trying to see the day-to-day operations of the empire, particularly if the community like the Qizilbash are located in what we call border zones or frontiers. There's really no border as we understand today. So I started to question my own assumptions about what the border is or was between the Ottomans and Safavids. And I found myself in a place where there's really no clear-cut border, even if we can talk about certain zones, even if we can talk about certain zones of influence between the Ottomans and the Safavids that changed hand. But the land was not the one that changed hand, because what made land were the people living in it. And I soon started to realize that it was actually these people who were living in these regions that were changing hand between the Ottomans and Safavids, made them important and made them relevant for both of them. So this marginal, particularly from the modern Turkish perspective, this marginal, isolated, persecuted minority or religious community, the Qizilbash, actually started to emerge as a very important actor that did not really receive the attention that it deserves. And I wanted to do that in whatever capacity I could. And this is basically what I have been doing during my PhD years. And then, and now I am working on a book that really looks at 350-year period between the Ottomans and Safavids, not only at the formation of imperial identities level, but also at the formation of individual and communal identities between Sunnis and the Shia, between the Qizilbash and non-Qizilbash, or Qizilbash to be, because for these two imperial states, imperial authorities, everybody could be everything if they were either forced enough, or if they were threatened enough, or if they were tolerated enough. So I really wanted to see this fluidity in an environment, in a context of religion, which we really do not assume as a fluid one. Because when you look at who converts, there are really no big numbers of mass conversions anymore, and they usually happen at the individual level nowadays. And I wanted to see how it happened in the past, particularly in the 16th and 17th centuries. And what I found was we are really seeing mass conversion, and mass conversion in a way that not everybody is actually studying the religions as we are supposed to do before we convert, but the religion or what it meant for their day-to-day life actually factored in terms of who they wanted to be, or what they wanted to be known as. And as labels were important for the imperial authorities, they were also important for the subjects living in these territories. So I think, before giving any other spoiler from my talk, this is where I am, or my intellectual story. And if you have any questions, I'm not sure about the format. If there are any questions about my intellectual biography, I'm more than happy to answer them. If not, I think we are just going to go to the talk part, right, Ishan? You let me know, please.
Normally, that's what we would do. But I even before you invited questions, I thought that I would break the normal format just to ask. So if I understand well, you spent 4 years kind of accidentally on a degree. And then is it the choice of history was also kind of accidental, and then you took the taste of it and you stayed?
Yes.
That's very interesting. I wanted to ask this because I hope these talks, well, I know that some of our MA students are watching this talk, and then I hope many others will do so. So on how these things just can happen, and then how one navigates one's own life according to the opportunities which arise. Yes, and one more question on that. Do you feel that your 4 years in communications have any give you anything now in your research, or it?
Not in my research, because those two are very different, or the way that I studied in my first university degree, not knowing where I am gonna be now, really, like I really didn't have the idea. I didn't know what was gonna happen. And it was really, I was really in a place in my life that I didn't know what I was supposed to do. I was just following the crowd. I was just doing what the common sense will say, that you are a very good student, but there are certain things that you can do and you cannot do. And I actually skipped a very important part in that question, in that story, is that growing up, I always wanted to be a lawyer, because good students will always either be go to law school, or they become doctors, or they become engineers in Turkey, me growing up in 1980s and 90s. And I really did not have an interest in medical field or an engineer, but I was always big into discussion. I was always big into debates. I was always big into reading and writing. And I thought, okay, so then as a good student, I should be a lawyer. But the school system in Turkey, it's so complex, and it actually became even more complex in the late 80s and early 90s, where as a very good student, I wasn't able to go into law school, because I'm not going to bore you with details. And then I was left with a very small number of schools that I could get into. And history was one of them. But I had no idea what you would do if you just read history. There was an education program to become a history teacher. That was a separate school. And as well, I don't want to be a history teacher, and I have no idea why you would read history if you don't want to be a history teacher. And then I said, well, there's this school of communication that is the highest score, requires the highest score to get into, and this school looks very well known, so maybe I should just go and give it a try. I did, but it really didn't fit my personality. I passed my classes and I passed them with very high remarks. But I really was not a part of a community at the time. So how I see my first 4 years is actually, looking now, it's kind of helped me later on to build into that social capital that I was lacking very seriously, coming from a family with no background and no awareness. My parents were amazing parents, and they did everything in their capacity to support us, me and my sisters, but they did not know these questions. Like they didn't know what you would do with this score instead of that score, what university will be better, what program or what department will be better. So there was a very critical lack of what I call intellectual capital, social capital. And I think I needed to spend those 4 years to come to a point in my life to understand what I want, and what will make me happy intellectually, and what wouldn't make me happy. Maybe this was going to happen in the first round if I had these type of conversations with my family, with my parents, in terms of like what school you would go and what you would study, and what it means to study history, what it means to study law, what you will need to do to study law, etc. So in that regard, I never see it as a waste of time. Initially, I did. Particularly after starting my second degree and being the oldest in the classroom, I thought like, oh, what am I doing here? But soon I realized that actually taught me to appreciate and to also make more cognizant and some basically smarter choices, and to have a better roadmap, because I already did it once and I knew how things will evolve into other things. So long story short, I really think that I needed those 4 years to build into that social capital that I was lacking, to kind of like make up for the gap, for the intellectual social gap.
Thank you very much, Ayşe. Your reply really justifies my question, and I think it will be a great lesson for many students in that. Yeah, you do 4 years in a field, and it doesn't mean that you cannot do something else, and it doesn't mean that you lost 4 years of your life. Not at all. It's so thank you. And now, okay, let's get into the present research of yours.
Perfect. So let me share my screen. Can you all see it? Okay, so now it is the boring research. I'll do my best not to make it boring, but to stay on topic and also to stay focused. I'm sorry that I'm going to read from my notes rather than just trying to wing it here. Let me start. Religion is the 16th century for nationalism, a renowned historian once argued. It's true that religion served as a key factor in molding not only individuals, but also states in the early modern era, functioning similarly to nationalism in its modern renderings. Particularly during the 16th and the 17th centuries, religious movements and religiously motivated political transformations all around the globe became prevalent. Ultimately, these movements drastically altered the geopolitical and socio-cultural conceptions of belonging and obedience among a wide variety of communities. At the same time, however, religio-political commitments and loyalties remain malleable to an extent that the very same actors, both state and non-state, who rallied behind clearly demarcated confessional doctrines also accommodated themselves to the ever-changing socioeconomic and political subtleties of their circumstances. My talk
Ayşe, would you mind go just a tiny bit slower?
Sure.
Because yeah, it's very interesting, but very also intense.
Sure. So my talk today is about this important yet often ignored facet of the early modern era. The Ottoman and Safavid realms, as you can see in the map here, offer a perfect canvas for the study of the enmeshment of religion and politics in the early modern era. And I particularly like this map because it really doesn't have very clear-cut borders and boundaries, as I was mentioning earlier, but it really shows you how they actually become in particular places, how they become mixed, right? It was in these geographies that religious motivations and worldly priorities of the actors involved shaped the states and societies profoundly in tandem and with long-lasting consequences. On the one hand, between the mid-15th and the mid-17th centuries, the schism between the Sunni and Shia denominations of Islam fully materialized under the rule of these two mighty empires, as they are known and practiced today. Through crafting rigorous imperial ideologies and waging a series of seemingly sectarian wars, both against each other and against their own subjects, who didn't adhere to the official creed of the state, the Ottoman and Safavid rulers, as well as their religious and bureaucratic elites, presented themselves as the guardians of Sunnism and Shiism, respectively. Sunnism in the Ottoman case and Shiism in the Safavid case. Ottoman and Safavid Sheikhul Islam's staunchly sectarian fatwas, or the equally influential polemics written under or for the two imperial courts, successfully served the purpose of creating imperial stances, emphasizing the homogenization of the religious landscapes of the two respective regimes through idealized common belief, practice, and rituals on the one hand, and underscoring of heresy and being an enemy of heresy on the other. However, simultaneously with the sectarianization of imperial vocabularies, there existed considerable discrepancies between the state-run formulas, binary dichotomous formulas, which prescribed a strictly normative confessional hierarchy, and the day-to-day policies and practices that the very same actors implemented. The state was not the only actor engaged in real politics in this picture. The subjects themselves often pursued a combination of religious and socioeconomic interests in their interactions with both the Ottoman and Safavid states for the purpose of guaranteeing safety and security, as well as pursuing social, political, and financial advancement. Ultimately, many and often conflicting religio-political policies and practices in these domains emerged, coexisted, and shaped each other at the individual, communal, and imperial levels. In other words, while unyielding sectarian discourses dominated the stately circles in the capitals, heavily adaptable and evasive loyalties dominated the inter-imperial contact zones of Anatolia, Kurdistan, Mesopotamia, and Western Iran. In my search, I historicized this duality: straightforward sectarian narratives on the one hand, and convoluted and conflicting practices on the other. And I do that with its leading actors and complex circumstances. I'm particularly concerned with the intersection of politics and religion and its enmeshment with the often neglected sociocultural, financial, and geopolitical priorities of the participants involved, both state and non-state in the longue durée. My work is therefore a departure from the dominant corpus of solely theological or merely political accounts that have overstated the importance of religious rulings, fatwas, court chronicles, and polemics written in these two empires that ultimately helped depicting the relationship between the two as a manifestation of confessionalization in the Middle East in a comparable way in Europe in its conflicts between the Catholic and the Protestant states and actors. Furthermore, the vast majority of the existing scholarly work has stayed within the conventional borders of either the Ottoman or Safavid empires. Stemming mainly from understandable linguistic limitations, this prevalent approach, however, has perpetuated the narrative of irredeemable sectarian polarization between the two sides. While benefiting from the accumulated knowledge in these common approaches, I scrutinize the topic of sectarian divergence in the early modern Middle East via situating the Sunni and Shia polities, policies, and practices within a combined temporal and spatial context. I construct a new historical framework which is interested in gradual, yet momentous religious, sociopolitical, and fiscal transformations between the two empires in an extensive chronological and integrated geographical scope that goes beyond the traditional understanding of history writing with its heavy emphasis on conventional boundaries, either political or sectarian, or on single rulers, years, or battles. I conduct this inquiry through examining an often neglected and understudied actor, the Qizilbash, who were a perfectly situated group of people as not only the founders of the Safavid Empire, but also the largest and best documented non-Sunni community of the Ottoman Empire in the early modern period. Then the question is, who were the Qizilbash and why did they matter? And I'm going to give a background, a historical background here. While the year 1501 is always given as the beginning point of the Safavid Empire, a 200-year-long politicization, militarization, and Shiitization process set the scene for that year. The Turkish-speaking Safavid family emerged firstly as the head of a Sufi order in northwestern Iran in modern-day Ardabil near Tabriz in the early 14th century, and gradually became a regional powerhouse via complex socioeconomic and religio-political acts during the next 2 centuries. And ultimately, the Safavid family consolidated its authority as a state in the highly contested regions of Eastern Anatolia and Western Iran at the turn of the 15th century. As a significant move in this lengthy course of developments, a key leader of the movement called Haydar created a distinctive identifier in the form of a 12-gored crimson headpiece called Qiziltaj. Red, and in Turkish it means red crown. And as you can see, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but the arrow points to one of these red headgears depicted in an early modern illustration. This headpiece symbolized Haydar's followers' allegiance to 12 Shia imams, because it was 12, it was one piece, but rolled around 12 times. and to the Safavid family as their spiritual and political leaders. Shortly after, both the followers and the enemies of the Safavids began to use the term Qizilbash, which means red heads in Turkish, as their main moniker. By the 1520s, the term Safavid and Qizilbash had become interchangeable, both in Iran and beyond, including the Ottoman Empire. So when you look at Ottoman documents, there's this constant use of the term Qizilbash, and in many cases, what it means is the Safavid state that the Ottoman calls as the Qizilbash, or the Qizilbash state, or the Qizilbash army, right? And in many cases, these same documents talk about the Ottoman Qizilbash, the subjects of the Ottoman Empire who have very clear sympathy towards the Safavid dynasty, and the state will use the same moniker Qizilbash. Along with creating this highly symbolic identifier, a central strategy of the Safavid movement and later of the Safavid state was to reach into the lands both near and far with the aim of cultivating sympathy for and adherence to its ideology. Among others, the regions of Anatolia, Kurdistan, Upper Mesopotamia, and Western Iran quickly became entangled with these Safavid efforts to spread its ideology and sympathy for itself. Safavid efforts included transformation of the network of disciples, whom we call khulafa, into a centrally organized and monitored religio-political activity in their head holding a seat called Khalifatul Khulafa at the Safavid court. And also it included the commissioning of books and objects to be circulated among the populations that the Safavid court was aiming to reach out, and using material offerings, tax breaks, privileges, positions, and autonomy, particularly for tribes and tribal communities in the border zones, to convince them either to migrate to Safavid Iran or to stay in their places and pledge their allegiance to the Safavid court. As the Safavid efforts were taking roots and in a very effective way, the Ottoman state was expanding into the very same territories. Ultimately, as the borders of the Ottomans and Safavids expanded eastward and westward, respectively, the two political entities became neighbors, with a vast zone of competition between them. The Ottoman capital ultimately realized that the Safavid activities within its borders went beyond being isolated incidents involving insignificant people and their insignificant stories. The number of heavily Qizilbash populated towns and villages soon began to increase, and by the 1550s, the majority of central and eastern Anatolia had become Qizilbash. And here I would like to take a break to read a part from a report from a Venetian officer who was stationed or commissioned or sent to Istanbul, to the Constantinople or Ottoman capital in the 16th century. And this is a part from his report that he wrote and sent back to Venice. And it says, all of Asia Minor follows the Persian religion based on the doctrine of Ali, disciple of Muhammad, all the Muslims' common prophet. The Turks call these people Qizilbash because they usually wear a red band on their heads in order to be distinct from the others. What frightens the Ottoman state most is that they know well that if they were to experience some major defeat by the Persians, this might give rise to serious unrest in Asia Minor, which belongs almost completely to the Persian religion. And Persian religion here is Shiism, but particularly a Qizilbash understanding of Shiism that is a religious but also political sense of belonging created by the Safavids as a universal message, not just for the boundaries and the borders of the Safavids, but as a universal message that was supposed to be spread into broader territories. And of course, Ottoman lands being the next one to do that with a serious degree of sympathy towards Shiism, particularly for the family of Ali and Fatima and Hassan and Hussein. This really made these territories an easy target, an easy place to go and work on. Signaling the same situation, and just to give you an idea that this is not just one Italian guy's exaggerated observation of what was happening, An Ottoman imperial order sent to the governor-general in Central Anatolia in 1578 stated that since killing all Qizilbash would mean killing everybody, therefore the local authorities should instead investigate and differentiate the Qizilbash between those who are in close contact with the Safavid court and those who are not. So realizing that the number of the Qizilbash became too big for Ottoman state to just push aside as a small group of heretics, the state really needed to develop a more complex policy and practice that was really centered around who was just practicing Shia and who was a Shia who also was in close connection to the Safavid side, to the Safavid Empire. Particularly throughout the 16th and much of the 17th century, when the Ottoman-Safavid rivalry dominated the scene with long-lasting wars, a complex array of motivations and impulses weighed differently on an individual's or group's decision to adopt or to renounce adherences, either religious, political, or both. These motivations often included pre-existing religious sensibilities that I mentioned, particularly about Ahl al-Bayt, universally popular millenarian predilections, charismatic leaders, and a desire for salvation. In many cases, however, sociopolitical pressures and fiscal enticements were as, if not more important for determining the choices that the one made. Therefore, the regions from which the largest number of people responded to the Safavid efforts and became Qizilbash were also those experiencing socioeconomic problems or political disturbances due to the Ottoman policies of sedendarization, centralization, and heavy taxation. This is how I try to bring together the issue of religious conversion and sociopolitical and financial conversion, if I may call it that way. Predictably, the Qizilbash quickly became an existential threat to the Ottoman state, not only because they now constituted the majority of the population in core regions of the empire, but also because their sympathy and oftentimes overt loyalty towards the Safavid state quickly went beyond respecting its dynasty and observing Shiism, albeit loosely. Tangible sociopolitical and fiscal practices, such as accepting Safavid disciples as revered figures in their communities, sending money and valuables to the Safavid side under the name of Nezir or Nuzul, migrating to Iran, refusing to fight for the Ottoman army against the Safavids, and organizing rebellions against the state directly defied the interests of the Ottoman imperial authority in volatile territories. And here there's a document that I wanted to share with you from the 16th century. And in this document, Istanbul is asking the governors of the Central Anatolian province, where the majority of the population is Qizilbash, to see how much money the people are sending to the Safavid side and what to do with that money, and how it should be calculated in terms of its amount and also confiscated, and how the tie between the Qizilbash, Ottoman Qizilbash, and the Safavid Qizilbash should be cut, because this is a big threat to the state and state's authority in its core territories, particularly in this case, Central and Eastern Anatolia. Even though what ultimately emerged was a convoluted relationship between the states and their subjects that cannot be simply labeled as sectarian, the general tendency in the literature has depicted the Qizilbash as either the victim of the Sunni Ottoman Empire, whose keen sword swung ceaselessly against them, or as the accomplice of the Shia Safavid Empire, who used them as a fifth column. Certain ideological waves of the 20th and the 21st century in Turkey and Iran perpetuated this essentialist approach taken towards the Qizilbash again and again, and I'm more than happy to delve deeper into this in the Q&A if you're interested in historiographical debates, particularly in the 20th and 21st century. I instead survey how the Qizilbash became or came to conceive their own distinct character and place in a broad regional and religious context that reveals the complexity of their relationship with both the Ottoman and Safavid states, because as the numbers of the Qizilbash increased, its members embraced their regional, sociocultural, political, and fiscal multiformity, which created a diverse group of people with differing backgrounds, loyalties, principles, priorities, and ultimately actions. So as the number of the Ottoman Qizilbash increased, it really became impossible to talk about them as one unified community, because within that populous community, then you started to see certain Qizilbash actors, communities or tribes responding to certain priorities in different ways, right? Therefore, rather than assuming that the Qizilbash as a whole automatically located itself within a rigid sectarian or political framework against the Ottoman state or for the Safavid state, I study and try to understand how they in fact embarked on an open-ended exploration of where their interests and loyalties lay and how their very existence shaped the imperial narratives of both the Ottoman and Safavid capitals. A major question that is at the core of my inquiry is therefore how the Qizilbash communities in these regions affected the relationship between the two imperial centers via influencing the formation of sectarian and political policies and practices at both the state and individual levels in the early modern period, from Ottoman Sunnism to Safavid Shiism and everything in between. And here on this page, you can see a small number of Qizilbash sources, because if I'm writing history of Qizilbash, it wouldn't be complete without using their own sources and if I just rely on Ottoman documents, right? And of course, comparing Ottoman documents with Qizilbash sources, one easily sees that particularly Ottoman state being a very heavily bureaucratic state, outnumbers the Qizilbash sources by a lot, but at the end, we still have material in front of us to study the Qizilbash from its own writings, rather than solely relying on the state and state's language and rhetoric. And here you see the first one is actually a book called Tarikh-e Qizilbashan. And in this book, it lists around 35, 40 Qizilbash tribes with their family trees, and when they became Qizilbash, and when they converted, but also when they moved to the Safavid side, if they moved to the Safavid side, and if they did not, where they stayed, where their authority was relevant. And the second one is an Ottoman-Turkish translation of a very important Safavid Qizilbash source called Safat-ı-Sefa that was written in the 1350s, but this translation is from 1560s, that shows the relevance of translation movements of this very important source for the Anatolian Qizilbash. And in the introduction in this translation, the translator says that the reason he's translating the book into Ottoman Turkish is to make it understandable for the masses, because the original book was written in Persian, and when you look at the versions circulated in the Ottoman lands, you will see Ottoman Turkish versions circulating much more heavily than the Persian versions. And the other one, the last one, is a family tree of the Safavid dynasty that starts with actually the Shia Imam Kazım and going all the way to Shah Tahmasp. And I was able to locate a number of these family trees that are not embellished, that shows that they are not actually made for imperial consumption, because they are just single pieces of paper and they are heavily worn and heavily used. And to me, they signify, again, the heavy circulation of these family lineages as a way of showing the relevance and importance of Safavid dynasty in the Ottoman Empire. So these are all from these three is just the number of Qizilbash sources that I am using in my work. So if I'm trying to situate the Qizilbash as an actor, as an active participant in the Ottoman-Safavid imperial competition and rivalry, what is the theoretical or conceptual framework that I'm trying to situate the Qizilbash in? And here there are a number of books and works that I have been using and referring to. In a successful empire, Burbank and Fred Cooper have convincingly argued, and I quote, "Neither consistent loyalty nor constant resistance, but the contingent accommodation was what took place. At the core of the imperial ideologies of the early modern era was therefore the implicit principle according to which different peoples within the polity would be governed differently. Of course, Jane Burbank and Fred Cooper did not write this for the Qizilbash, but it actually plays, it is the exact same thing in terms of what happened between the Ottoman state and its Qizilbash subjects, or between the Ottoman state and its subjects in general. There was really no single form of treating the subjects. We can talk about contradictions. We can talk about multiple ways of Ottoman state treating its subjects. But when you look at why and where, you really see a clear ideology behind it, which is making sure the rebellions are crashed, making sure the taxes are collected, making sure there's safety and security to a degree where people are not trying to rebel, or people are not trying to migrate to other places, and keeping the land worked on. As political entities with a great degree of heterogeneity and of reliance on both incorporation and differentiation, most of the imperial centers follow the practice of mixing, matching, and transforming their ways of rule to adapt to changing circumstances within and beyond their boundaries. The territories that I study provide us with a perfect opportunity to see two empires' different tactics to rule different people. As we all know, the Ottoman state became increasingly engaged with the efforts of codification and bureaucratization in the 15th century, which inevitably brought about further rigidity in norms and punishments. Furthermore, particularly after the conquest of the Holy Lands of Mecca, Medina, and Jerusalem in the early 16th century, the Ottoman state defined itself first and foremost as a political entity grounded in a strict religious hierarchy. One of the most common phrases in the imperial vocabulary for that reason became dinu devlet, religion and state, which implied the inseparability to a degree of the two elements in governance. However, while increasing bureaucratization and Islamization or Sunnitization of the state deepened its involvement in local affairs via crafting an imperial ideology that delineated an ideal framework for the relationship between the ruler and the ruled, the state's power and authority remained limited in its day-to-day operations. First of all, religious legitimation was invoked infrequently, and the phrase dinu devlet was mostly nothing but than a jargon. In the words of late Rifat Abu al-Hajj, the phrase was, and I quote, perhaps produced by the decision-making power under the aspect of perpetuating itself. Secondly, the territorial expansion of the Ottoman Empire and its bureaucracy in the 16th century didn't fully replace the often argued pragmatism and flexibility of the previous 2 centuries. I am a little more hesitant about the notion of pragmatism, and we can discuss that, what it means to be pragmatic and what are the possible problems of using the term pragmatic. But I think flexibility is a more neutral way of understanding this plurality of approaching subjects from the imperial center. In fact, the more expanded and bureaucratized the state became, the more flexible and also arbitrary it turned out to be, to simply accommodating the needs and priorities of its ballooning bureaucratic circle and increasing number of constituencies. As Faisal Hossein has recently observed in his book called Rivers of Empire, the Ottoman rule from one province to another exhibited significant differences shaped by local conditions, be it in taxation, public administration, or justice. And here what you see on the screen, a Safavid imperial letter sent to the Ottoman Grand Vizier Ferhat Pasha in the early 1550s. And in this, it's asking Istanbul if Istanbul really truly believes that the Mahmudi tribe, which is one of the important Kurdish tribes in the border, when they said they converted to Sunnism, right? It is actually asking Istanbul to be suspicious about these conversions taking place and how they believe that other reasons are playing a role behind them. And it's also nudging Istanbul, saying that you were calling these people mezhepsiz, which means heretic, when they were Shia, and now you are siding with them. Like, does that mean that you really believe what they are saying you in terms of when they converted? Or do you really think that the letter asks, did they change their sect? We don't think so. So there's also in the imperial level this suspicion in terms of conversion and what it really meant to become one or the other. Recognizing the limits as well as the elasticity of the early modern state naturally raises another question. What was then the power of its subjects, and what did their subjecthood mean? I approached the relationship between the ruler and the ruled with a novel understanding in which being an imperial subject does not necessarily denote passiveness. In other words, rather than situating subjecthood in the early modern context, either as a pre-citizenship and therefore powerless construct, or as a proto-nationalist concept with sharp-edged boundaries delineated by religious, ethnic, and linguistic senses of belonging, I define early modern subjecthood as a notion that entails active collaboration, participation, and negotiation in addition to opposition, insubordination, and rebellion. In this understanding of subjecthood in the Ottoman-Safavid rivalry, subjects were the cultivators of multidimensional perspectives where they, just like the states in which they lived, maneuvered between multiple centers of authority, be they judicial, economic, or religious. Subjects' cross-cutting loyalties and affiliations created a certain degree of adaptability and agility as opposed to absolute adherence to fixed and uncompromising political and/or sectarian stances. As Natalie Rothman has argued in the context of the Ottoman and Venetian empires, one can call this type of subjecthood trans-imperial, or in the words of Laura Doyle, one can label it as inter-imperiality, where the subjects understood their own subjecthood as oriented towards multiple centers of authority, and a certain nimbleness and adaptability followed. From this angle, one can see the utility of approaching relationship between the state and its subjects laterally, as opposed to the top-down or bottom-up approaches that imagined relations between the ruler and the ruled in terms of vertical relations of power. It is beyond a doubt that a sectarian hierarchy was created by the Ottoman and Safavid states, a hierarchy that was closely linked to their dire need for legitimacy and authority. However, the relationship between the Ottoman and Safavid states and their Qizilbash subjects cannot be simply labeled as the Sunni rulers' straightforward persecution of the Shia ruled in the Ottoman context, or the Shia rulers' unbending fondness of the Shia ruled in the Safavid context. One of the major manifestations of this power dynamic was that in the intensifying rivalry between the Ottoman and Safavid states, the Qizilbash with its own heterogeneity emerged as a crucial party in negotiating and maintaining the border between the two empires. Although by border, I do not necessarily mean the conventional borders resulting from peace treaties, but borders demarcated by spheres of influence that could sometimes be limited in one's own, but in other cases could extend deep into the other polity's territory. Particularly in the Ottoman case, we have hundreds, if not thousands of documents, orders sent to the Qizilbash located in Western Anatolia or in the Balkans, miles, thousands of miles away from the Safavid border that talks about their loyalty and their sympathy towards the Safavid court or the Safavid ideology that actually shows where the spheres of influence are actually sometimes far, far beyond the conventional borders that we attribute as the beginning and ending points of legitimacy or authority. I call this type of demarcation of power and legitimacy domestic or inner borders. Every Ottoman Sultan and Safavid Shah, being fully aware of the importance of the volatility of both their conventional and inner borders, had to negotiate or renegotiate their position, not only with respect to the high-ranking members of their court and the provincial elites, but also with respect to the populations of the borderland regions. In this case, the Qizilbash, the former Qizilbash, and Qizilbash to be. Therefore, while the language used by the Ottoman state differed significantly ranging from heavy emphasis on the heresy of the Qizilbash to heavy emphasis on potential venues of coexistence and collaboration. The Qizilbash adopted their own complexity for multiple purposes, ranging from simple survival to the full exertion of authority. In other words, the alienation between the Ottoman state and its subjects in the tumultuous 16th and 17th centuries didn't always culminate in outright rebellion and persecution. In fact, many Qizilbash amassed a significant degree of power and played a legitimizing role as the cultivators of the land, the providers of tax revenues and foot soldiers, the defenders of active border zones, and the de facto mediators between the states. Moreover, countless Qizilbash from both urban and rural environments reacted to centralization and overtaxation of the Ottoman state by migrating to the Safavid realm, either individually or as members of tribal groups. The Safavid side's assurance of greater autonomy for the tribes and less taxation for households, in many cases regardless of their sectarian identity, played a significant role in this picture. The end result was that the Ottoman state and its institutions attached qualifiers and adjectives to the term Qizilbash to differentiate between different types. With this type of categorizations, the capital and its provincial extensions aim to separate the tax-paying, land-cultivating, and battle-ready Qizilbash from tax-evading, rebelling, and migrating Qizilbash, which proved to be more crucial for the empire rather than just simply looking at what sect they were coming from or what sect they were believing in. In similar vein, when relations with the Safavids were rough, or when the Ottoman Qizilbash subjects wished to show their spiritual devotion to the Safavid Shahs by sending financial support to the center of the order in Iran, or the capital of the Safavid state, the Ottoman central authority deemed them an economic and geopolitical threat to its stability and suppressed them more forcefully than other Qizilbash who were left in peace, according to the Ottoman documents. More interestingly, opportunities for advancement, albeit limited, were also given to specific Qizilbash individuals and communities, particularly tribes, as imperial favors, lands, titles, privileges in the form of tamars, muqatas, and offices. To conclude, I would like to emphasize again that the Ottoman and Safavid states' day-to-day policies and practices were the outcome of its complex engagement with forming and maintaining an imperial authority in a highly competitive environment. Various and often conflicting concerns related to state formation, such as territorial expansion, land cultivation, tax collection, and military recruitment, were at the core of each of these two empires' determination of its response to its Qizilbash or non-Qizilbash subjects, as well as each other. Therefore, it is not surprising that in many instances, Istanbul asked the Safavid court to send Ottoman subjects back, even if they became Qizilbash, even if they were Shia, and justified these requests by invoking the peace treaties which banned the migration from one side to another. Or in a similar manner, the Safavid court more often than not banned the migration of its Sunni subjects to the Ottoman side and asked Istanbul not to accept them into the Ottoman territories again, with referring to the peace treaties that were signed between the two centers. Taking these important factors into account while studying the emergence and sharpening of the sectarian narratives and policies ultimately defies the long assumed primacy of a sectarian adherence shared by the ruler and their subjects as the sole barometer of loyalty and approval. I would like to end my talk with an important disclaimer that the relatively pluralistic approach taken by the Ottoman state towards its Qizilbash subjects that are outlined in my talk shouldn't be seen as either an example of Ottoman tolerance or the exceptions to or aberrations in the tense relationship between Istanbul and its subjects. They are in fact examples of the imperial center's complex policymaking procedures to maneuver around the issues of political, fiscal, and religious legitimacy. In other words, the Ottoman authorities' willingness to overlook one's non-Sunni confessional identity was at times tied to their political and fiscal concerns, and in many cases, various categorizations were applied to differentiate between the peaceful and the hostile Qizilbash, and the motivating factor for the state was never tolerance, but maybe accommodation, we can call it. All in all, the oscillation of the Ottoman central authority between the two ends of the spectrum, i.e. persecution and accommodation, is easily detectable in sources which were closely associated with the day-to-day problems and practices of the empire, rather than a broad ideological and sectarian rhetoric that dominated the religious rulings, court of accounts, official court accounts, and or the polemical literature. And this type of inquiry is needed to show how communities with their own historical memories and traditions integrated themselves into the empire as active participants. Only with this complexity in mind can the plethora of situations in which both sides, i.e. the Ottoman-Safavid rulers on one hand and the Qizilbash rule on the other, continuously acted against their perceived positions, emerge not as aberrations or oddities, but as explainable and in fact expected behaviors. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ayşe. This was a most impressive talk, really, showing all that fluidity, and again in a very learned and pinpointed manner, showing things which are extremely important for the study of states and communities in general, not just the one you talked about. I really very much enjoyed it, and I believe, well, I think it was a privilege for all of us to listen to you. Before we turn to the questions, I'd like to advertise the next talk, which will be by Hansi Liu, the role of emotions in Islamic political thought, a late Abbasid mirror for princes by Ibn al-Jawzi. So I put it here. So we will have a treat next week as well. I hope, Ayşe, you can maybe come. And then, yes, I will switch over the camera, thanking you again, not the camera, the recording, and then invite for questions.